Hello, welcome back to COG 266, Brains, Minds, Consciousness. This time, we're going to dig a little deeper into how we can start to construct useful internal versions of things, models, and how sort of we connect that to what we already know about neurons, right? So, this is habituation and classical conditioning. You may have heard of one or both of these. We're going to dig in. So, last time we watched as scientists through history and philosophers started putting together a modern take on the mind, how information that travels through the neurons should be considered as distinct from the stimuli that caused them in the first place, right? They are their own type of information. And then how we internalize new knowledge in memory by observing patterns in the world, right? Resemblance, contiguity, causation, and form and test different hypotheses, right? So the idea being that we are attempting to take information from the world and use our internal understanding of the world to update and create new predictions and to adjust our predictions. So a big component of all of this, the main idea here is this idea of relations and association, right? So the association is the process of connecting two ideas, stimuli maybe from the outside world, our responses to those stimuli and all that kind of stuff to each other, right? That can be an association. An association can be a reflexive type thing where just stimulus causes response. You know, your knee jerks when someone taps on it. But it can also be more an association to an internal thing, like memory. So before we discuss the concept of associating lots of things, let's talk about how our minds typically respond to one thing at a time. And this is a process known as habituation. So, habituation. When we are repeatedly exposed to a stimulus, we become habituated to it. So here's a little guy. Bang! Something happened, right? Repetition makes the stimulus cause less and less response. So over time, number of events, you hear a bang every day, you're like freaked out. Oh my God, bang, geez, come on. In fact, I can tell you, in the alley behind my house, when the wind picks up, there's a huge banging sound because the wind is flopping something around. At first, it freaked me out. I thought somebody was moving garbage cans around or something, right? Just rummaging through them, banging around something. But as it continued to happen, it's less and less alarming, right? I don't get as worried about it. It's a little less annoying. It's a little less, you barely even notice it, right? After a certain amount of time. So the point about this is that the key element of this is not necessarily that my understanding is updating, that something important and key is changing about how I internalize my understanding. The fact that I understand that there is wind causing it, of course that helps. But even before I knew what the problem was, it was just the repetition. Repetition, 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 repetition. In fact, if I keep saying the word repetition, 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 you'll notice eventually the word itself starts to lose its meaning. Your neurons are being saturated with the activity and it stops causing the same mental effect, essentially because it's not connected to anything. It's not signifying anything. A loud noise is maybe alarming when you first hear it because usually it's associated with bad stuff, right? You don't want loud noise. But if it keeps happening, nothing's really changing. Now, the question is, what's the function of this, right? So, let's talk about recovery and relearning. So, stimuli will recover after becoming habituated. So, after some time away from the exposure, the response strength can return to near original. So, you have habituation on day one. Okay, bang, 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 bang. You get used to it on day one. Day two comes around, you're actually close to the original. You are, the first exposure, you are close to as alarmed as the first time. And that, the idea being that you will recover from this. hinting at the idea that maybe this is more biological than an internal, mental type thing, right? It's not necessarily a strong new understanding you're building. It might just be some of how neurons work. We will investigate this. So another element of this, though, that's interesting is that it's not just these short-term effects that go away completely. There's also relearning effects, meaning it takes less time to habituate each day, right? So on day 7, it takes less exposures to a bang sound to become less responsive to it, meaning you can develop a learning pattern over time. So, to observe habituation, it's most clear when we have observable behavior associated, flinching and yelping. Sound, oh no. But it also does occur internally, like when I was repeating the word repetition, right? Repetition, repetition, repetition. It becomes this word that sort of loses its shine, right? So even if you're not responding to a stimulus externally, your internal response will also diminish. When you finally stop noticing the annoying hum of the radiator, as an example, right? You might initially be like, ugh, that's so invasive. But at a certain point, it doesn't even enter into your system anymore. The information is dampened so much that it's lost. And remember, specific nerve energies, specific, neural patterns, what's in common between these two things? Observable behavior and internal behavior. Hey, baby, it's all neurons. So we can become habituated to internal stimuli like our own thoughts, emotions, and reactions too. It's not just, it's all a property of neurons. Again, we'll touch on that. So habituation and magnitudes, there's another element of it. When the strength of a stimulus can drive the strength of a response, so a loud bang might make a more alarming experience than a quieter bang or a distant bang, right? The habituation process is also modulated, so it takes longer to habituate to a stronger stimulus. So a big loud bang, you're not going to get as used to it as quickly. It's still going to alarm you for longer. So if our neurons are set up to habituate to stimuli, what happens if I'm exposed to similar stimuli? So the idea of a bang versus a different sounding bang, right? I hear, I live in a place where there's a lot of trucks going by, for example. If I'm hearing that every day and then I hear, say, a loud motor scooter, it's a very similar sound. How does that work? So this is the idea of generalization and transfer. So a similar stimulus will cause a similar reaction. But it depends on how similar the stimuli are. Kind of like it depends on how strong the response is in the first place. So remember the law of resemblance, right? But the question that kind of sticks out here is, how do you measure similarity of sound? So similarity. One measure of similarity is just the pattern of activation. One spoken word will likely activate the same sets of neurons as a very similar word, right? So cat and hat, but also maybe cat and feline at a different point in the chain of neural activation. So the actual sound itself, but also perhaps the context surrounding a stimulus. So context also relates to meaning and thus similarity. So the point is that context can be key in habituation. So habituation is actually context dependent. So habituating to a stimulus at home won't necessarily extend to an experience in the outside world. If I'm very used to hearing trucks banging at home just because I'm in my house and in my surrounds, then the response while I'm in the car to a loud truck banging sound, it might be not great. But even worse, it might be really bad if I'm in an alley late at night and I hear a loud banging truck sound, right? The context matters quite a lot. My response will be quite different in these different scenarios. So, one last interesting feature of habituation is you can use this to pair stimuli. So sometimes pairing a habituated stimulus with a novel but somewhat unrelated stimulus will cause sudden response recovery. What's that mean? Well, that means that we've changed the context, right? So a bang on its own that I become habituated to, if the bang suddenly has flashing associated with it, then I might resume my startling response. The overall pattern of all the stimuli coming in has changed. The original response is once again primed again, which doesn't make a lot of sense. You'd think, oh, well, I'm used to the sound. Why would I suddenly be worried about the sound again? Because the context has changed. So, habituation in general, this is this fundamental way that we respond to stimuli out there in the world, right? We get more used to certain stimuli as our neurons become less and less likely to fire in the same pattern when we're exposed to it. And after all, that bang didn't kill or wound us, right? So talking about the function of habituation, why would we keep exerting metabolic effort to keep responding to it? Why would a neuron that is, responsible for, whoa, we got to really respond to these threats, right? It is part of some sort of threat network. Well, if it's going off all the time and it never gets used to anything, it's just going to be firing forever, and we're always going to be stressed out and tired from exertion. Remember that our neurons are very hungry. So that's the idea of habituation. We've covered lots of the little functions and tweaks about how it works. Now let's talk about why habituation works, right? As I've been hinting at, it's actually the properties of neurons that cause this type of thing to be possible. So, first evidence of habituation that we understood in a deep sense, as habituation, right? Everybody knows you can, quote, get used to something. We've known that since we've been, cognizant animals. But the first time we saw it, explicitly in a scientific setting was studying the sea slug, Aplysia californica. So the mollusks are great for study because they have big, simple, easily observed nervous systems. They don't have that many neurons. They don't have that much to do, right? They don't have a whole lot of work to be doing every day. So they just kind of got to mosey around and find food and avoid getting eaten too badly. So let's have a look inside. So, sea slug habituation. Sea slugs have a gill, like most sea creatures, designed to extract oxygen from the water. If threatened, it withdraws the gill in order to protect it. It's pretty important, right? Meaning, here's the response. I poke the sea slug, just, with a prod or with a finger even, it will withdraw the gill. It's like, no, hey, stop. I'm pulling that inside, right? This is a reflexive behavior, and it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint because if it couldn't do this, a lot of sea slugs would lose the gill, or it would become damaged beyond repair, and they would die in a way that is pretty much avoidable if they have neurons, But this reflexive behavior can be habituated. So this is the sea slug siphon circuit. The gill retraction response is caused by a very short neural circuit. Sensory neurons in the siphon, right? They are activated. There's some small number of interneurons, and they don't need a lot of central nervous system stuff. They just have some hidden layer, some neurons that just help process things. And then they have the motor neurons in the gill, right? Given what we know about neurons so far, we know about sensory neurons, right? That they can take information in. We know that they can connect to different spaces and different things, or I say spaces, different neurons, right? They can impact other neurons' activations, right? So the motor neuron on the output end that can affect the gill and make it do things is taking information from these other sources, right? So information comes in through a poke, a sensory neuron. The interneurons do some work, and they decide whether or not we need to pull the gill in using the motor neuron. So if habituation is the process of these neurons becoming less and less responsive, what are some ways that we know neurons can become less likely to respond? We can think about this. We've talked about a lot of ways that neurons can be impacted, right? Well, the first question is it maybe inhibitory connections, right? So inhibitory connections is some other neurons may get involved and inhibit activation, right? This isn't quite right for the sea slug. For one thing, it's too complex. This would require a lot of neurons to watch and regulate. Slugs don't have that. They don't have other systems layered on top of their basic circuits to make them work in different ways. It would also be too slow. So these kinds of connections, they take time to develop, and habituation is observable each time the stimulus is poked, right? They happen every single time. The response changes slightly. So it's not some set of smart neural networks somewhere inside the slug's brain deciding on this for it. That's too complex. What about refractory periods? There's refractory periods in neurons, as we've talked about, is this time that they can't activate again, right? We know that based on the internal activation, the way that the action potential travels makes it so the neuron can't fire again quickly, right? But the issue with that is that it's too short term. Refractory periods are like in the hundreds of milliseconds. So that wouldn't explain this sort of long-term slow degradation of the activation of this, right? This wouldn't explain how it's this cumulative effect, right? The neurons would likely just bounce back to full responding after their refractory period. So that's not the way that this works. What else do we have? If you've thought a little bit about this and come up with neurotransmitter depletion, well, then that's interesting. So, neurotransmitter, we know, that's responsible for the activation of the next neuron. We also know that it takes time for them to get reabsorbed and reconstructed in the cells. If a neuron fires too often, it's going to run low on neurotransmitter before it's able to recover. Interesting. So now we have a very basic component of neural cell anatomy that can deplete. And we see that, think about the neural circuit of the slug on the left there. The sensory neuron is saying, things happened, activate, retract the gill, right? Things happen, retract the gill. Things happen, retract the gill. But the neurons can get tired, right? They can run out of enough neurotransmitter to cause a sufficient response, or even, not even just sufficient, but strong response, right? You poke them the first time, it retracts quickly. Poke them the second time, third time, fourth time, maybe it still retracts, but it's sort of slower because it's not as strong of a response, until eventually it's not going to retract at all. It's out of the neurons. It doesn't need, it's going to take some time to rebuild my ability to respond. So that's habituation in slugs. So we see this clear picture, right? The slug's habituation to being disturbed can be traced directly to its neural anatomy. It's the properties of neurons and neurotransmitters themselves that lead to this habituation effect. And I hope you can see how that could scale up to brains, the more complex things, right? Ultimately, remember that it's all just neurons, so it doesn't matter how complex a network is, it still lives by the rules of neurotransmitters. If we activate the same network too much, it can lose a bit of steam. Okay, now that's interesting. But what about relearning, right? We have this ability to the relearning effect of habituation. We have this ability to kind of keep track of the neural activation, or not the neural activation, the fact that, hey, I don't need to be worried about this particular response over and over. So to explain relearning, neurotransmitters are responsible for the initial habituation, but from there, other processes need to get involved. new inhibitory connections, for example. So say the inhibitory parts of these circuits, they get a little stronger when we've been inhibiting them, right? Or maybe neuromodulation. Maybe another neuron that likes to slow down this network becomes more active in this particular pattern. Point being that these pave the way. These are more of the sort of basic cell biology stuff we've talked about that can pave the way for long-term changes due to habituation. But that response recovery that we see at the start of each new day is very easily explained by the fact that, hey, the neurotransmitters are back. They have recovered. The neural system has caught up to its backlog of, hey, I need more dopamine, please. And it's able to respond again. Though it will respond a little bit different the more times this happens. So, habituation altogether, it's this very fundamental process of minds, right? We are able to get used to things. We don't always respond to things in the same way. We are able to sort of reduce our activation, our surprise response to various things. And it's very cool because it describes one important facet of our mental experience, right? This ability to stop responding to something that would normally produce a response in us. And we're able to explain it on a neural level. We're able to say, well, we have the explanation for how habituation works. It is a function of neurotransmitters. That's pretty great. That's, tying one piece of our mental experience to a piece of a well-understood, well-explained biological process. That is key. That's the heart of cognitive science. We're trying to understand the abstract, immaterial world of the mind through the biological stuff that we do understand and can observe. Another interesting thing here is that, remember the laws of association. Habituation demonstrates that one of the pieces of the laws of association, remember, resemblance, right? There's resemblance, contiguity, and causation. Stimuli that bear a resemblance will produce similar responses and share some degree of their habituation. That's cool. That's interesting because that shows an association. If I get used to one stimulus, I can get used to similar stimuli. Now, again, if I change it too much, obviously I revert to a brand new response pattern, right? But this is still, we're digging at the edge of the idea of being able to connect two thoughts on a neural basis. But a question stands, how else might we associate two ideas? Enter Pavlov. Pavlov, you may have heard of, right? The fellow who has dogs and can make them drool, right? Pavlov's experiments get into the concept of contiguity, right? So he was a physiologist, actually, studying digestive function. He was not a psychologist. He was just kind of interested in how dogs can consume and eat food, right? But he discovered this classical conditioning phenomenon, or what is also known as first-order excitatory conditioning. This is the dawn of behaviorism. It's this focus on the influences stimuli and behaviors have on one another, right? So how do stimuli in the world produce behaviors of an organism? Less focused on what's happening in the mind. But it still focuses on a fundamental piece of the mind, the association. So, types of stimuli and associations. Some associations are naturally occurring reflexes. I hammer your knee moves, right? I present you food, you salivate because your mouth needs to get ready. Ooh, I'm going to eat something tasty. Other stimuli are neutral. They don't necessarily emit or evoke a specific response. It's just like the sound of birds, right? Or a random tone that happens in your environment. You might react to it, but you're not necessarily going to have a strong reflex to that. You don't have a pre-programmed complex pattern that you need to exert to make it happen. So this is the fundamental idea. There's two main categories of stimuli in this classical conditioning world of things that do cause reflexes and things that don't. So, classical conditioning is the way that neutral stimuli come to elicit responses, things that the organism doesn't have any particular interest in, but then begins to respond to. How do it work? You may have seen this before, so just bear with it. Classical conditioning. Step one, you present the unconditioned stimulus, and then the creature drools, right? So food, yay, food is given, drool happens. Not necessarily drool, it doesn't have to be that sloppy, but like you salivate. Your system says, ooh, activate the mouth, we need to get ready to eat, right? Alongside that, you also have a neutral stimulus, right? This is a stimulus that won't really produce any response, like a bell, right? A bell, you ring it. Again, the organism may notice it, but no very interesting response is going to happen. Here's what you can now do in the classical conditioning world. You present the unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus, with the bell, and of course, you get that the salivation happens, right? You start to generate saliva so that you can eat, right? Now, you pair this over and over. You do this every time. Every time you bring the dog food, you ring the bell, right? Ultimately, you have created a conditioned stimulus. You've created a new pairing of ring the bell, my body says time to salivate. The neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus that now elicits the same response as the unconditioned stimulus. Even if there's no food in the building, you ring the bell, you start to salivate. Now, we can understand that in a sort of top level. We get it, of course, because that bell ringing has become associated with the sort of the broad concept of food, right? Now, again, the behaviorists wouldn't go as far as to suggest that. They just say, hey, look, all I can talk about is what's observable. I can pair the stimulus and create a new response. Conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. But just to tie it to your understanding of, this is a way that we can connect ideas, contiguity. So, how does this acquisition work? So each new presentation of the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus pair together, right? Each time you pair them, do it every time, it will increase both the probability and strength of the conditioned response, asymptoting at some maximum level, right? Eventually you can't really condition it any further, but it gets to be pretty strong and it gets to be consistent, right? So the more times you pair stimuli together, the stronger they will be associated in the system that is observing them. So again, for a dog hears dog hears bell and gets food, hears bell, gets food, hears bell, gets food, do. Continue it over and over and over. Eventually, it is a very strong, initially it's not very strong and it may not happen every time. Ring the bell, the dog has not necessarily, on trial 5, the association isn't necessarily built yet. But over time, it becomes very sturdy, very strong. There's also, though, extinction. So that's a strong word. You may have heard that in biological context. This is the psychological idea of extinction. So a conditioned stimulus, right? You ring the bell, present it without the food. Well, eventually that's going to start to decrease both the strength and probability of the conditioned response, right? So you learn it over the first day, and then the next day you do the conditioned stimulus without the food there, without the unconditioned stimulus. Initially, they respond sharply, and then it decays and they stop responding altogether because you're no longer giving them food. But it comes back each day a little bit because the neurons will revert to whatever their initial state was. But again, kind of like habituation, it gets easier to forget this, right? So after several days of not presenting the dog with food and bell together, you just give them bell, eventually they're going to stop responding very strongly and very consistently. But Fascinating thing, if you give a long enough gap in conditioning, a previously learned conditioned response can spontaneously recover. So on day one, you train them. Day two, you do the cruel thing of, hey, I'm going to ring the bell with no food, and then I'm going to do it again. But then you stop conditioning at all. You don't do the bell, you don't do the food. You just give them a normal day. None of the stimulus. After a while, day 9, they're back to full strength. It's a fascinating piece of this function, right? This is a function of the association that it's still there for some reason. It's been trained in, and it's able to be inhibited slowly, but then it comes back. Further, here's an odd one. If you've extinguished a conditioned response, sometimes presenting the conditioned stimulus with a new and unrelated stimulus that has nothing to do with the food can bring it back. Remember, that's kind of parallel to the contextual sensitivity of habituation. So day 1, 2, 3, you extinguish it. Day 4, you present the tone with a flash. Again, it changed the context in this strange way that excites the neurons again. The pattern is rebuilt. It's fresh, right? And again, this is not the same as spontaneous recovery, where you have to have no conditioning for a while for the response to come back. Disinhibition is day 4. You've been actively, decreasing you've been extinguishing the conditioned response, but then suddenly you pair it with a new stimulus together, and it activates again. Wild. So that's classical conditioning. These processes show how we can come to pair distinct phenomena from the world as related to each other. We should produce a similar response because we recognize that these things go together, right? They occur together, so we should kind of connect them. So if I always ring a bell with dinner, I'm going to connect bells with dinner. Bell makes hungry. Now, can you think of anything from your life that you started to pair together out of habit, and for better or worse? I can tell you one from mine. Once upon a time, my alarm on my clock radio was just this solid tone, boop, right? Turned out that tone that was waking me up every day out of my blissful sleep was the exact same tone as the censor tone on The Daily Show on Comedy Central. Jon Stewart would curse and boop would appear, and it would freak my brain right out. It's the sound of being stirred from a stupor, being stirred from blissful sleep. I hated it. So I actually changed my alarm clock for that reason. Because I had begun to pair this exact tone with a pretty unpleasant experience of being awoken. It affects our lives, right? This is not just for mollusks and dogs. This is, again, how we do. That's how brains and minds do. So, let's dig in a little bit to how classical conditioning works. It seems classical conditioning is yet another fundamental process of associating ideas, right? We've found another piece of the puzzle. We had resemblance. We now have a little bit of contiguity. But how is it working, right? What associations are forming to produce these new responses? And there were two competing theories: stimulus-response hypothesis and stimulus-stimulus hypothesis. Let's talk hypotheses. The stimulus-response hypothesis, SR, is this idea that it may be the case that the neutral stimulus becomes linked directly to the conditioned response, right? So as I ring the bell with dinner, suddenly there is a brand new connection being built between the bell ringing sound and salivation, right? A new neural path is carved. We could phrase it that way. So for the dog, in the dog and bell example, the idea is that in the machinery of the dog's mind, the bell leads directly to a salivation response. The stimulus-stimulus hypothesis, on the other hand, suggests that, well, okay, maybe the neutral stimulus is linked to the unconditioned stimulus indirectly that then causes the conditioned response. That is, the dog hears the bell, it activates some memory of food, and then food triggers the response. These have different implications for the neural basis of this situation, right? In one sense, we're just creating a new direct route from bell rings, food good, or mouth do things, right? Bell rings, mouth salivate. In a different response, we have bell rings, memory activated, mouth salivate. These are two very different routes through the brain. So how do we investigate this? Well, the research question was, what should happen if we weaken the unconditioned association, the reflex, right? Habituation, our friend, right? Under these different hypotheses, under the stimulus response hypothesis, hey, that's fine. The new association has nothing to do with the old one. It's a brand new thing. It's a new thought. It's a new connection, a new association. It can be fully distinct from the original. The stimulus-stimulus hypothesis says, the original association is part of this chain. It's part of how this association works at all. So if we habituate, right, if we decrease the activation of the food response to saliva, then under the stimulus response hypothesis, nothing's going to happen. It's fine. Under the stimulus-stimulus hypothesis, this predicts a reduced response. If I damage the connection between the original stimulus and the food response, the salivation response, then the bell can't do anything, right? Because it relies on that connection. So, enter Rescorla, 1973. How do we weaken a response? Habituation. Yeah. I already blew the secret. So, this is the conditioned suppression paradigm. It's the idea you train up a new response from pairing a neutral stimulus with a reflex, and then you habituate the original reflex, right? See what happens to the new response. So here's the setup in Rescorla. Before anything happens, they train a rat to enjoy pulling a lever to get food. Rat likes food, rat pulls lever, great. This is conditioning, but it's incidental to the study. This is sort of just the baseline stuff of how the rat can interact in its little tiny environment, right? Here are the associations that we're focusing on, right? Here's the unconditioned stimulus. There's a bang near the lever, right? The unconditioned response is rat avoids the lever. It doesn't want to do that. It's not happy about lever bangs, right? Conditioned stimulus, flash a light with that noise, right? So we associate the light with the noise. The noise scares the rat. That's the unconditioned connection, right? Flash a light along with the noise. Okay, new conditioned response. Even if I just flash the light, the rat's going to avoid the lever. Oh shoot, the light's flashing. I don't want to be over there. Something annoying is going to happen. Something bad is going to happen. So, to illustrate, rat likes lever. Rat hears bang, rat goes away. Does not like lever. Rat hears bang and light together. Suddenly, rat sees light, rat avoids lever. Even though rat loves lever. Remember, rat loves lever. Lever gives food. Rat loves lever. But we can make rat avoid lever temporarily. Here's the trick. Remember, the whole idea here is we have to damage that initial stimulus response. We use habituation. So we habituate the rat to the loud noise. Just repeat the exposure over and over. This weakens the link, right? The rat it doesn't care about the sound as much anymore. So, does that impact the effect the light has on the rat? Here's the result. It significantly reduced the conditioned response. The light no longer produced an avoidance response because we damaged the connection of the sound, right? This supports the stimulus-stimulus theory, right? Weakening the unconditioned stimulus, the food salivation stimulus, right? It also weakened the conditioned stimulus. So the stimulus-stimulus theory was supported here, which indicates that it's not just a brand new singular connection from sound to salivation, from new response to old, or from new stimulus to old response. It's not just a straightforward connection. It has to go through, it is mediated by the original, some internal connection of the original. Cool stuff. We can see how science works. Yay. Now, there are some weaknesses to the stimulus-stimulus theory. The conditioned response is often similar, but a little bit distinct from the unconditioned response. So the size and structure can differ, right? The dogs, for example, their saliva is a little different depending on whether or not they're responding to a bell or actual food, right? Or to roll back to the rat, and this is hypothetical, I don't know if this is the exact thing, but for example, the rat might avoid the lever in a different way, right? If it's light versus sound. It still builds the association, but it's not perfect. So another element is if you're using painful stimuli, the conditioned response actually isn't pain, right? It can't be, because the pain is not happening, right? Maybe the sound is loud and painful, but the light is just a light. It's not pain, it's fear. That's a different connection, right? That's a different response out of the organism. So the important thing being that not all components of the unconditioned response become part of the conditioned response, right? So presenting food to a dog produces a lot more response than just salivation. But hearing the bell might just kind of make them, ooh, interesting, there could be food coming, right? So that's not to say that there's nothing to this stimulus-stimulus theory. In fact, it's very important to understand that it's not a direct new single basic link from one new concept to an old one. It's a mitigated link. It's a complex link to build these new associations. So this altogether has been about association, right? We examined some of the fundamental ways ideas become connected in our minds. Yay! Fascinating stuff. Habituation is a natural reduction in response to repeated stimuli, right? We have this very strong neural basis for how habituation works too, which is super cool. Classical conditioning is a way that various stimuli can become paired and associated, right? This stimulus and this stimulus might be connected in some way, and now I can respond to them in a different way. Both of these are very, I say very, fairly is a better, as written on the slide, fairly simple mechanism, right, of associating ideas, information, and memories in our minds. Next time, we're going to go a little deeper into contiguity and, more important, contingency, the idea of prediction, of causation. So, that's it for today. As always, here's the final thought. We are starting to see the neural basis for how some of our reactions to the world can be changed over time, both through getting used to them and connecting previously unrelated ideas to one another. What's a basic external association you can recognize that you've formed in your life? What about a more subtle internal association you may have formed? Consider how the known properties of our neurons can explain this rich internal experience. All right, that's it. Thanks. Take care.